Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is shouyi, cultivating stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice, and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. This is because any meeting between Daoists always involves the Tao in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and a more open discussion. For these meetings, I want to talk about some foundational topics that may be of more general interest. So I'm going to share my screen with you. For this Lundao, I want to discuss Daoist Quiet Sitting, which is a major form of Daoist meditation and our primary meditation practice. In holistic and integrated Daoist training, quiet sitting relates to stillness practice, jingong, which is connected to innate nature, xing. So sometimes it's also called xinzhai. So stillness practice is primarily meditation. We can think of this in terms of mind training. We can compare it to movement practice or donggong, that's usually connected to life destiny, Ming, or body training. So I'll come back to this in the next Lundao on Yangsheng, on nourishing life practice, or health and longevity practice. In general, if we're following a kind of cosmological model, thinking about seasonal attunement, we place more emphasis on quiet sitting, on stillness-based meditation in the fall and winter, which is the yin time of the year, and then focusing on movement practice or Yangsheng more in the spring and summer, so the yang part of the year. Quiet sitting or Daoist meditation in general is usually solitary, but sometimes we practice it with one or more Daoyo, so companions of the Tao, Daoist spiritual friends. There also are some communal forms of Daoist meditation that are primarily modeled on Chan or Zen. So one of the reasons to practice this alone and or with a couple other spiritual companions is because of Daoist energetic views in terms of relationality. So there are different approaches and different understandings of this, but one key aspect is that each of us has an energetic quality to our practice. And so as we come into a space and share that space and that practice with other people, we're influencing each other. So if we have similar orientations, affinities, levels of cultivation, then it's going to be mutually beneficial. It's going to be mutually supportive. But depending on the person we're meditating with, it might be disruptive depending on what they're working on. So in terms of these Daoist approaches, we can be more intentional with our own practice and with those we share space with and kind of mutually support each other. We can also open up the practice to other people who might not have the same level of cultivation, but do it in this compassionate way, this inclusive way where we support their practice, even if it might be energetically disruptive to the overall practice. So the first thing to do here in terms of quiet sitting is to just pause and enter stillness, enter silence. So be in that place within yourself, because we're talking about a contemplative space. We're talking about contemplative silence. So here I'll just say that in a modern context, there's a lot of discussion and even debate about silence. So we're talking about contemplative silence as a path to being connected to the Tao. This is different from politicized silencing, which is going on all the time in many different ways. So this is a voluntary form of silence that's theologically infused, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There are many types of Taoist meditation. So in my way of thinking about Taoist meditation, in my analysis and discussion of the Taoist tradition more generally, there are 5 primary types. So I've written a lot on this. There are a number of talks online as well. But the first major type, and these are actually chronological, they're in historical order, so I'll explain that in a moment. There's apophatic or quietistic meditation. This is emptiness and stillness-based meditation. So this is what we're focusing on today. So that's why I put an asterisk there. There are a lot of different technical terms that I'll go over in a moment. So there's not one specific term that correlates to this type of meditation, although shouyi, guarding the one, might be the most well-known name for it. Visualization, so zhuanxiang, literally maintaining thought. But here it has a technical Taoist idea of actual visualization. There's also a way to understand this as actualization, depending on the practice. So are we imagining something when we visualize it, or are we actually bringing it into reality? The third one is ingestion, fuqi. If you know something about Taoist practice, fuqi practice, literally eating qi or ingesting qi, ingesting energy, is oftentimes associated with yangsheng practice, with nourishing life practice, but there are specifically seated meditation practices that focus on this. Excuse me. There's also inner observation, neiguan, which primarily develops in the Tang Dynasty. It's a form of Taoist meditation influenced by Buddhism, and specifically Vipassana or Vipassana, so insight meditation. And then the fifth one, the last kind of major form, is internal alchemy or neidan. And inside of this, there's also a type of practice specifically for women called female alchemy, nudan, that develops much later in the late imperial period. And one important thing to note about internal alchemy is that it encompasses and includes most of the other practices. So if you're doing a full kind of internal alchemy practice, you would be doing the other types of meditation as well. It obviously is system specific and lineage specific, but usually that's the case. Just to briefly mention here, our primary practice is apophatic and quietistic meditation, but we do have training and experience in all of these major types or methods. Historically speaking, these types of Taoist meditation emerge at different periods. They're oftentimes associated with specific movements and also texts. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through all this. I just want to give you a historical sense of how these practices developed. So apophatic or quietistic meditation emerges in classical Taoism, visualization in early medieval Taoism, the same for ingestion. In terms of inner observation or neiguan, that's late medieval Taoism and specifically emerging in the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907. And then neidan, internal alchemy, as fully systematized. So what we can really talk about as internal alchemy as such is a late medieval and late imperial development, usually dated to around the end of the Tang Dynasty, so 10th century, and then coming to a kind of fuller expression in the Song Dynasty and to a certain extent into the Yuan. You can just look through this since it's online. You can study it on your own. You can think about it. As I mentioned, I've written a lot of articles on this. It's also in some of my books. But the key thing is apophatic or quietistic meditation is emerging around 300 BCE. Ingestion and visualization practice around probably 200 CE, maybe a little earlier, depending on what text you're looking at and how we're dating things. I mentioned inner observation in the Tang Dynasty, so probably early Tang, maybe 700s or so, and then moving into internal alchemy that I mentioned before. And then you just have some representative texts here. So that's quite complicated in terms of which texts we read and study and apply and so on, and then which text might be representative. But I'll just mention that visualization and gesture practice are oftentimes specifically associated with shangqing, or highest clarity. So there's an interesting kind of tradition-based understanding of these various practices. So what I want to focus on today, as I mentioned, is quiet sitting, or jingzuo. This also gets translated as tranquil sitting or sitting in stillness. It literally means still sitting. So it's kind of open. It's the most common modern Daoist name for apophatic and quietistic practice. So I'm going to explain a little bit of the historical connections. The practice itself goes back to classical Taoism, to the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism, but not the term. So the history of the term is somewhat complicated, but there is this strong emphasis on sitting in stillness in classical Taoism and throughout the Taoist tradition as a whole. Etymologically, jing, stillness, which I've talked about a lot in the other Lundaos, is kind of interesting from a Taoist etymological perspective. The left side is qing, that here we can understand as pure, and the right side is jiang, or contention. So if we read this text, especially through a practice lens, and think about Taoism more generally, it kind of invokes wujiang, non-contention or non-competition. So as we practice this, we're moving into a condition that's absent of jiang, purified of jiang or contention. That includes with ourself, with our own states. There's an unclear history of the term jingzuo. But as I mentioned, jing is present throughout the tradition and especially emphasized in classical Taoism, the text of the inner cultivation lineages. In English, this type of practice is sometimes referred to as apophatic meditation or quietistic meditation. I tend to use both because they both capture some aspect of the practice. So apophasis, that leads to apophatic as a description, is more about emptiness or the lack of something. In technical theological terms, if you say apophatic meditation, a lot of times it's about negation. But here we're talking about moving beyond even negation, being in some kind of emptiness or stillness or silence. Quietism is a more general category, and we might even think of this as a movement. For example, you find it in the Roman Catholic tradition. It's obviously a minority position in that tradition, but historically that is the case. Or the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, as a Protestant Christian denomination. Anyway, that's a different talk to think about the comparative aspect of it. But quietism means what it sounds like. Quiet is the primary emphasis. So a lot of times this involves kind of open receptivity and acceptance, trusting in the way things are, especially from a theological perspective. But again, being rooted in stillness. So following this path of a kind of contemplative approach and a contemplative presence. There are a lot of classical and foundational Taoist technical terms. These are oftentimes overlooked or misinterpreted by people that aren't reading the text in a technical way that's really about contemplative practice and even mystical experience. But we find a lot of terms, and all of these are helpful for understanding the practice, especially from a lived perspective. So baoyi, embracing the one, which appears in the Tao Te Ching. Gui Gun, returning to the root, also in the Tao Te Ching, interestingly defined as jing, as stillness in the Tao Te Ching. Shou Jing, also in the Tao Te Ching, guarding stillness. Shouyi, guarding the one. The earliest occurrence of shouyi is in the Neya, in inward training, but it also appears twice in the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang. Xinzhai, the fasting of the heart-mind, and zuowang, sitting in forgetfulness. So we'll look at some of these, but just briefly, you can see baoyi and shouyi are both emphasizing a certain kind of approach to protecting this unity. So thinking about the relationship of our own unitive state with the Tao as the one. Gui Gun, or returning to the root, with the root being both a name for the Tao, but also our innate nature, the stillness at the ground of our being. So we're returning to that. The other characters of these next phrases also have shou in them. So shou is one of the major technical terms for meditation in the classical period. So we also have shouzi, guarding the feminine, or shouzhong, guarding the center. Xinzhai, the fasting of the heart-mind. So we could just refer to this in a simple way as heart fasting, or even a mind retreat. Jai can also mean retreat. So what's interesting about this is obviously it's focusing on the heart-mind, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the idea of fasting. So withholding ordinary nutrients. So we kind of purify the heart-mind. So we allow, in this case, spirit to emerge, or some kind of pure consciousness to be present. Zuowang is sometimes mistranslated as sitting in oblivion, but then there's this question of, well, what's the verb, right? Do we obliviate ourselves? So I prefer to translate it as sitting in forgetfulness, but we can also think of it as seated forgetting, or sitting, or forgetful sitting, or something like that. So zuo literally means to sit, and wang means to forget. But I prefer to think of wang here as a contemplative state, paralleling jing, stillness, and also shu, emptiness. And that's what's helpful about translating it as forgetfulness, because all of them then have this quality of being in a state of some kind of ness. The other reason that this is helpful is then when you translate, or when we talk about wang in a verb sense, it's forgetting. Okay, so we have these pieces. So as we saw with xinzhai, there's this emphasis on the heart. So this is the pictographic character for heart, for xin. And it relates to other technical terms. So xinzhu, the techniques of the heart-mind, these 4 major chapters of the Guans, of the Book of Master Guan. But one of the reasons to put this here is that Taoist meditation focuses on the heart-mind as the psychospiritual center of human personhood. It's also psychosomatic, so that's why I prefer to translate it as heart-mind rather than just heart or just mind. It could be either or both of those, but it's oftentimes talked about as the center, the zhong. So yes, the center with an uppercase C can be the Tao, but the center in terms of contemplative practice can be the heart-mind as the center of the chest, or even the navel region as the kind of energetic center of the body. But here, xin is associated with innate nature, xing, and also more technically and in a more kind of systematic way thought of as the storehouse of spirit. So in the fuller Taoist tradition, the heart-mind is thought to be, especially the heart as a physical location, is thought to be the storehouse of yuanshan, original spirit. We also saw the emphasis on yi, the one, in both bao-yi, guarding the one, and shouyi, bao-yi, embracing the one, and shouyi, guarding the one. And here, from a Taoist perspective, yi, the character that's in the middle of the circle, is oftentimes read from this Taoist etymological perspective as a circle on its side. So when we see that character, we're thinking of the idea of unity, of connection, of oneness. So yi refers to the Tao again, and you can see this is a recurring theme. The Tao constantly is invoked in these practices as our orientation point, but also the ground of our being as innate nature. So it's both everything as the one with an uppercase O, and also all individual things, the individual ones. We can think of this as reality, the one, the process that we go through, wanting united unification, and also the experience. So oneness, union, unity. But in general, when we talk about bao-yi, embracing the one, and shou-yi, guarding the one, we're talking about merging into the Tao, returning to this non-differentiation, this original inherent connection with the Tao. There are 4 major steps of Taoist meditation. You can think of these as moments of practice. I prefer not to think of them as stages. But when we practice meditation, we also oftentimes do go through them kind of sequentially. So alignment, zheng, relaxation, song, stillness, jing, and absorption, ding. Alignment is primarily about the physical posture. So Taoist meditation is psychosomatic. There's a strong emphasis on physical embodiment, being directly connected to consciousness states. So proper posture is centrally important, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we can also think of Zheng alignment in terms of this fourfold alignment or fourfold aligning that we find in the Neye, in the inward training chapter of the Guanzi, which is probably, depending on how we look at it and how we date it, the earliest classical Taoist text. And that text talks about first aligning the body, then aligning specifically the limbs, then aligning qi, and then aligning the heart-mind. And so sometimes the last two are reversed. So it depends on the Daoist and the community and the kind of conversation. Is qi, our energetic being, more primary, or is the heart, our psychological states, our psycho-spiritual condition, more primary? And obviously those are interrelated, but sometimes those are reversed, just so you know. There's also a kind of emphasis on moving through these, right, in different ways. So first we align our body, then we go through a process of relaxation. And the deeper we go into relaxation, the more we can enter into the ground of our being, which is stillness, which is xing, which is innate nature. But beyond even stillness, because stillness can still have content, stillness can have like residual agitation, stillness might not be stable, there's ding. So ding literally means stable or settled. Sometimes it gets translated as concentrated. But I prefer as a contemplative state to translate it as absorption, meditative absorption. And part of the reason to translate it this way is because later on this character gets used to translate the technical Buddhist term that obviously is part of the larger Indian spiritual repertoire of samadhi. So yogic stasis or meditative absorption. And that means obviously different things in different contexts and different traditions. But it does have this idea of being in a more concentrated state. So not in the sense of concentrating on something, but in this case, being absorbed into the Tao. So moving through this alignment, postural alignment, relaxation, allowing everything to kind of settle, entering into stillness, and then eventually becoming absorbed into the Tao. So thinking about the importance of posture, I talked about this a little bit in the second Lundao on view. In Taoism, there's a macrocosmic and microcosmic correspondences. This is also true of traditional Chinese culture more generally, including the relationship of the body to heaven and earth. So when we look at this, the upper line is heaven, the lower line is earth, and the middle line is the connection or the alignment between those two realities, you know, yang and yin and so on. So we can think of this as actually living on the earth. So the connection that we make between the heavens and the earth through our lives. But as a body configuration, the heavens usually corresponds to the head, and the earth, it depends, can correspond to the kind of navel region. If you're standing, it oftentimes corresponds to the feet. So finding this actual alignment through the body, through a specific body configuration. And in the practice of quiet sitting, there's a specific body configuration. There's a specific posture that's used. And that's usually referred to in English as modified Burmese posture. We also use the zuowang hand gesture. So you can kind of look this up online. But for men, you touch all the fingers of the left hand to the tip of the left thumb. You take the right thumb and slide it in to touch the base of the ring finger, and the middle finger touches the outside base of the ring finger, and then the hands rest in the lap. For women, it's reversed. So that's the general posture the general hand configuration or mudra that's used for men and women in bowing. But for women, that's used in meditation. So if those mudras or hand configurations are uncomfortable, you can just try to reverse them. But there is a specific posture that creates energetic alignment through the body and also creates microsystems in the body. So this is really important. Again, thinking about the psychosomatic or even psychospiritual aspect of embodiment. So in that energetic posture, we're activating these meridians, we're connecting these meridians, we're allowing the body to become more integrated on an energetic level. And so you can look, we've created a practice session online video where I'll actually go through all of this in detail in a more technical way so that you can see what I'm talking about. But here, one of the interesting things, again, on the macrocosmic, microcosmic level is the alignment of the body aligning the heavens and earth of the body, but then also creating that energetic circulation pattern with the larger cosmos. So moving into the zhuangzi, so the fasting of the heart mind is in chapter 4, and sitting in forgetfulness is in chapter 6. And so this is the two passages. You must fast. I will tell you what that means. Do you think that it is easy to do anything while you have a heart mind? If you do, the luminous heavens will not support you. Unify your aspirations. Don't listen with your ears. Listen with your heart mind. No, don't listen with your heart mind. Listen with qi. Listening stops with the ears. The heart mind stops with joining. But qi is empty and waits on all things. The Tao gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness is the fasting of the heart mind. Xinzhai. I'm improving. I can sit and forget. I smash up my limbs and body, drive out perception and intellect, cast off form, do away with understanding, and make myself identical with great pervasion. Da Tong. This is what I mean by sitting in forgetfulness. Zuowang. So there are many interesting dimensions of this. The first thing is we notice that there's a kind of movement inward and downward. So we're disengaging sense perception. We're moving into the heart mind. So the kind of psychospiritual field, the center, and then we're disengaging that. So we're letting any kind of emotional and intellectual content go. Then we're moving on into the qi level of our being, so the energetic level. And that's what's empty. So that's what's basically all pervasive and connected. And that's where the Tao enters. So that's the space that allows this numinous presence of the Tao to come in. And what's interesting about the first passage here is you get this rare definition in the text. So it's like, what is xinzhai? What is the heart fast? What is the mind retreat? It is shu. It is emptiness. So then we know to what extent we're practicing xinzhai by how complete the emptiness state is. In the second one, it's also kind of directing our attention to disengaging sense perception, but it's also saying I'm forgetting my physical body. I'm going beyond form, so any kind of form. I'm getting beyond even like cognition, so any kind of cognitive activity. And what I'm really doing is moving into this absorption state. So here called da tong. So tong can mean connected or pervaded or penetrated. So we're fully connected. And again, it's almost like a definition here. This is zuowang. Zuowang is da tong, is great pervasion. So as I said, the reason that I translate zuowang as sitting in forgetfulness is I think that this is a meditative state and specifically an absorption state. Just to say a couple other things here, because I don't know how familiar you are with the zhuangzi, but this is actually happening in a larger dialogue in the text. So the first part of the dialogue happens in chapter 4, and then you continue to read the text, and then the dialogue continues in chapter 6. And if you look at the text carefully where it says, I'm improving in the second passage, it actually says hui. And so this is yan hui. So this is an imagined conversation between Kongzi, Master Kong, so-called, usually translated as Confucius, Latinized as Confucius in English, but right in Chinese, Kongzi, Master Kong, and his senior disciple, who often also happens to be impoverished, which is another kind of interesting dimension of it. But in this second passage, it's Yan Hui that's then saying, I've been doing xinzhai all of this time. Now I've found that there's a deeper level of the practice. And if you read it in context, then Kongzi says, oh, may I become your disciple? So the teacher and the student switch places in the context of the text. I also wanted to point out here that in the first passage, listen with qi, okay? So in the text, it says, Tingzhi yi qi, so ting qi, so listen with qi, has been mistranslated in the Burton-Watson translation as spirit. And for people who don't know Chinese, both on an academic and a popular side, there's misunderstanding and even kind of mistaken instruction on the practice. It's not talking about spirit, it's talking about qi. So again, it's an energetic view. So this practice, quiet sitting or apophatic and quietistic meditation, is rooted in wuwei, right? So there are different ways to read this. One way to read it is that wuwei is actually coming out of quietistic meditation. That is the understanding of how to live one's life, how to apply a contemplative presence in one's daily life is wuwei. So there's a lot of misconception about this. But the first thing is literally it means without acting or doing. So in a previous Lundao, I mentioned that I think of Wu, even though it tends to be a negation character, the first character, I tend to think of it as free from or absent of, and then moving into non or beyond states. So here, the technical translation would be something like non-action and also effortlessness. So this is quite complex and there's wide misunderstanding. I mentioned this briefly in the Lundao on view and the Lundao on the 9 practices. But sometimes this is misunderstood or misrepresented as reproducing habituation or following desire in the name of flow. But in fact, when we look at it in context, it's connected to various other Daoist principles, practices, qualities, and states, including desirelessness, namelessness, suchness, and unhewn simplicity. So wuwei is a key Daoist contemplative approach, principle, and practice. It's not an idea. It's not a concept. It's informed by and informing apophatic and quietistic meditation, that is emptiness and stillness-based meditation, which we're looking at now. So one of the key things from a Daoist perspective is that it's practice-based. It's not a disembodied idea or a thought. It's a way of being. It's a way of living. It's coming out of a contemplative practice and a contemplative experience. So it's about effortlessness, doing nothing extra, adding nothing extra. So if we apply this in meditation, if we think about meditation from the point of view of wuwei, which relates to the quietistic model, we let go of excess tension in the body. We allow the breathing to find its own natural rhythm. And when we do that, we find that the breath becomes longer, slower, and deeper. We also just disengage thought. So as we do this, as we just let go, what we find is that thoughts and emotions settle naturally, and we return into this state of kind of pure consciousness, so contentless consciousness. Theologically speaking, non-action is really about stopping doing everything that prevents you from being who you are. So stop doing everything that prevents you from being who you are. Now, one issue that comes up here is a view of self, which I talked about in the previous Lundao. But here, the informing view is that this relates to Xing, innate nature, the connection to the Tao. So if you have a different view of self, it won't make a lot of sense. But if you understand that at the ground of your being is this stillness, and if you just stop doing all of these extra things, right? If you just let go, you will find that this is the case. Beneath all of the agitation is stillness. Beneath the disharmony is harmony, and so on. So this relates to, as I said, Lundao, the second Lundao on view, and the third Lundao on the 9 practices. It really needs an independent talk from a Daoist perspective because there is so much misunderstanding, even to the point where we now have discussions about wuwei by non-Daoists, quote unquote, where it becomes more of a set of philosophical ideas, and it's not. It's a contemplative practice and a contemplative experience. So if we're reading it in context, especially in terms of the Tao Te Ching, it's related to zuowang, it's related to suchness. So one way of understanding this is the practice of wuwei, following the path of wuwei, of non-action, leads to suchness, and that's returning to the root. So the view informing this practice is focusing on Jing, stillness, that's the middle character. The left character is Dao, so by now you might recognize that. If you don't know Chinese, you've seen it a lot in my talks. And the right side is Xing, innate nature. And probably at this point you notice that I talk about this a lot. But one of the reasons to emphasize this is because it really does inform the practice. It's central for understanding the practice, but for also having fruition in the practice, which is innate nature, Xing, the heart mind that we were born with, is our original inherent connection with the Tao. And it is stillness. So we can think of innate nature as stillness with a lowercase s, which connects us to the Tao with that as stillness with an uppercase s. So in stillness, we realize this kind of unity, this oneness, going back to those earlier terms about embracing the one or guarding the one. So we can think of this as not stilling ourselves or not becoming still, but entering stillness. So one way that Taoists will talk about meditation is ru jing, enter stillness. So the stillness is there. The stillness is waiting for you. You are the stillness. So we can think of it as sitting in or as stillness, right? You are stillness. I am stillness. Reality is stillness. So beneath all of this agitation, beneath all of this distortion, beneath all of this confusion is the stillness of the Tao and innate nature. And this relates to the central importance of mountains. So one aspect of Taoism that I find really interesting, that I have a lot of resonance with, having done a lot of mountaineering and backpacking in my life, is the discussion of meditation as rushan, entering the mountains. So when Taoists use this historically, and if you're interested, Christopher Schipper has written a really interesting, influential book called The Daoist Body, and he talks about the multiple layers of mountains in Taoism. That's from my perspective, one of the most important contributions of that book. But this is also glossed in Taoism as Ru Jing, entering stillness. So when we say Ru Shan, enter the mountains, it can also mean Ru Jing, entering stillness. The image on the left is the body as a mountain. So depending on how familiar you are with what I refer to as Taoist body maps, you might not necessarily see it at first glance. You might just think, oh, I'm looking at a mountain. But actually those water movements inside are depicting the body. So the governing vessel on the right moving up the spine, and the conception vessel on the left moving down the front center line of the body. The 12-storied pagoda there is the trachea. So it's showing this kind of important energetic circuit in the body. And then when you look through the middle, it's actually connecting the heart to the basically mid-spine region. So there are subtle movement patterns inside the body, energetic flow or circuits inside the body. And then there's obviously a lot of Taoist technical terms. And I have a translation of this online and but a complete translation of it online if you're interested. So when we look at this, Ru Shan in Taoism can literally mean going to the mountains, and that's important for practice. It can also mean something like seclusion, right? So that is separating oneself from the mundane world or ordinary concerns. But it can also mean going into meditation. So Ru Shan, entering the mountains, means practicing meditation, and then therefore going into the mountain of the self, going into the stillness at the ground of our being. If you know the I Ching, that's an ancient Chinese text, the Classic of Change or the Classic of Changes. It's not a Taoist text. It predates established kind of distinct cultural traditions. Historically, it actually tended to be more thought of as a Ruist text because of the way that those texts got incorporated into that tradition, but nonetheless becomes influential, especially in the later Taoist tradition. There's a trigram called the Gun Mountain trigram, which is one yang line above two yin lines. And so this has the idea of things settling down, where that's the two yin lines becoming more like kind of stabilized in the body, and then the yang line representing some kind of spiritual clarity. So this trigram sometimes gets used to talk about not just mountains, but stillness. So if you read some Taoist internal alchemy commentaries on the I Ching, they'll say, oh, Gun Mountain is about stillness, which is about meditation practice. I find this really helpful because if we go into the mountains and we go into the mountains in a reverential way, we find the stillness and the silence of the Tao there. And that same stillness and silence is inside of ourselves in contemplative practice. So in terms of Jing Zuo in particular, so quiet sitting, this is one of the earliest references that I've been able to find, and this is really important for us. This is a passage from the Shiwu Lun, the 15 Discourses to Establish the Teachings. The full title is the Chongyang Li Jiao Shiwu Lun. So the redoubled Yang's 15 discourses to establish the teachings. It's abbreviated in a number of different ways, but this is from discourse 7 that's called Da Zuo. So literally engaging or undertaking sitting. That's a kind of more general term for meditation. This text is attributed to Wang Zhe. His Taoist name is Chongyang, redoubled Yang. He lived from 1113 to 1170. And one of the reasons this is so important for us is because we're part of the Shenzhen sub-tradition, the Shenzhen movement, complete perfection. And this text is attributed to the founder of this movement, so in the 12th century. There's debate about the dating of it, so it might be slightly later. There's a question of, did he write it? Was it compiled based on his teachings, or did later disciples write this in his name? That's kind of open. But the key point here is that at least maybe by the late 12th century, if we're being more conservative, maybe early 13th century, we have a reference to Jing Zuo. So what does he say? Sitting in meditation, Da Zuo, does not simply mean to sit with the body erect and the eyes closed. This is superficial sitting. To sit authentically, you must maintain a heart-mind like Taishan, Mount Tai, remaining unmovable and unshakable throughout the entire day. Maintain this practice whether standing, walking, sitting, or lying down, whether in movement or stillness. Restrain and seal the 4 gates, namely the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Do not allow the external world to enter in. If there is even the slightest trace of a thought about agitation and stillness, this cannot be called quiet sitting, Jing Zuo. If you can practice like this, although your body resides in the world of dust, your name will already be listed in the ranks of the immortals. So here we find that Jing Zuo is fundamentally a Taoist practice. It's already referenced in the early Shenzhen literature. There's emphasis here on not just thinking of it as seated meditation, but extending it out to our lives in general. And you have a kind of another quasi definition. If there is even the slightest trace of a thought about agitation and stillness, this cannot be called quiet sitting. So again, if we think about other ways to translate or understand this term, sitting in stillness, so not quiet sitting, but sitting in stillness, sitting as stillness, still sitting. So what Wang Zhe is saying here is that if we're meditating this way and we have a dualistic understanding of our practice, right? Oh, now I'm agitated, now I'm still. We're not actually doing quiet sitting. So we let go of all of that discrimination, of all of that rumination. And eventually what we find is this absorption state, which is non-dualistic. Okay. And then, of course, they use the language because Shenzhen had a very strong internal alchemy component. So they use the language of entering the ranks of the immortals. One thing I wanted to mention here is there's a kind of common misconception in the modern world. It depends if people know about Jingzuo at all, but they'll think, oh, this is a late medieval Ruist or so-called Neo-Confucian practice, or this is a Chan Buddhist practice. But in fact, this is fundamentally Taoist, and it influenced these other traditions. So when we look at stillness-based or emptiness-based practice in, let's say, late medieval Ruism or in Chan Buddhism, there's a strong Taoist influence coming out of classical Taoism, the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So Jing, stillness, was there from the very beginning. Not Jing Zuo, not the kind of combination of this, but we have already seen there is zuowang. So sitting in forgetfulness or forgetful sitting, right? Or these kinds of ways of translating zuowang. So you also, and I don't know if you've seen the first Lundao about the Daoist tradition, but one of the names of the Daoist tradition from a Daoist perspective is Qingjing wuwei Dao, right? So the way of clear stillness and non-action. And there you have stillness obviously connected to clarity as well. But there you have the idea of this is what makes Taoism Taoism, both Qingjing and wuwei. So clarity and stillness and non-action. And as we saw before, you also have the emphasis in classical Taoism on shoujing, guarding stillness, and also shoujing, cultivating stillness. So if we talk about more general defining characteristics of Daoist quietistic practice, so quiet sitting in particular, Silence is primary, as we saw in the passages from the Zhuangzi that are kind of some of the classical foundations of the practice. Disengaging sense perception and psychological reactivity, centering, settling down, letting go. Also emptiness, forgetfulness, and stillness. And again, to reemphasize this, this is why I want to translate Wang as forget or forgetfulness, because then it connects with Shu and Jing, emptiness, forgetfulness, stillness. So if we really apply the zuowang framework, we sit and forget until even forgetting is forgotten. So forgetting or forgetfulness are categories, they're filters. And if we think about that, what Wang just said, right, we have to let go of these conceptual frameworks. So even the method, whether it's zuowang or the idea of forgetting or forgetfulness, can become an obstruction to our practice. It can inhibit the actual experience that we're trying to have or the quality that we're cultivating. So as I mentioned, the Tao, stillness and innate nature being kind of a single field, interpenetrating, interrelated, right, ultimately unified. This practice is contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic. So this is absolutely essential for understanding the practice. There is no content. So we saw this with xinzhai, the fasting of the heart-mind, emptiness, right? We saw it in what Wang just said. There is nothing in consciousness when we're in the deepest state of quiet sitting. So letting go of any content, not being distracted, not charging any content, just letting it go. And eventually what we find is pure consciousness. From a phenomenological perspective, there is a state of consciousness where it is pure. There is no content in it. Okay, so it's beyond the kind of mundane thoughts and emotions that come up in the field of consciousness. It's non-conceptual, so it's a bit odd to say that when we're talking this way or when I'm speaking this way, because all of this is conceptual on some level. But this is talking about the practice. This isn't actually doing the practice or experiencing the practice. So non-conceptual in the sense of even though we're using concepts to talk about it, when we do the practice, we let go of any concept. So this is what Wang Zhou was talking about, like the idea of agitation or stillness. There is no agitation or stillness, right? We get into a state of non-discrimination, and that relates to non-dualism. So I am the Tao, you are the Tao. So not in the sense of like an egoic understanding of that or a narcissistic understanding of it, but the stillness of the Tao is the stillness inside of me. It's one single unified thing. And ultimately, using this kind of language is dualistic. So if I say Tao and me, that's dualistic. If I say subject and object, so there's me experiencing stillness. So we move beyond that. We move into a unitive state, a kind of transpersonal state. This relates to awakening and realization. So there are many Taoist terms for this. If you read classical Taoism, sometimes you encounter de Tao, attaining the Tao, but I prefer to translate this as realizing the Tao. Jue, liao, so not le, liao here, pronounced liao to mean realization or awakening, and then wu, that usually gets translated as awakening. What this means then is that there are parts of our lives and there are parts of our practice and there are experiences that we have where we're asleep, right? Or we're deluded, or we're confused. So part of the informing worldview is we're trying to wake up in the true spiritual sense, not in this kind of superficial way that awakening is used in a modern context, whether it's spiritual or in terms of social justice. Yes, I mean, there are awakenings that happen in relationship to social injustice or things like that. But we're talking about spiritual awakening, spiritual realization, the possibility of becoming fully attuned or aligned with the Tao, living in connection with the Tao, through the Tao. And that relates to mysterious and numinous presence. So in this practice, we become more attuned to the mystery of the Tao, to the mysteriousness of being alive, of being human, of participating in this kind of sacredness of aliveness and that numinous presence. So as I talked about a number of times before, that this is energetic. So the deeper we go into the practice, the more that we connect with this numinous presence, the more that it moves through us, the more sensitivity we have to it, the more that we start to see the world that way. One other point that I want to say here is that a lot of times people hear this language and they think of Chan or Zen Buddhism, but as I said, there's actually a way to read Chan or Zen Buddhism as a Taoicized form of Buddhism. So it's somewhat complicated in terms of understanding what dimensions of Chan or Zen are kind of coming out of an indigenous Indian Buddhist context or textual influence, and what are coming from Chinese culture and specifically Taoist influence. So that's like a whole nother complicated conversation. But one of the reasons to point this out here is that in Chan, in Zen Buddhism, you have the idea of jianxing, right? Awakening to awakened nature, or awakening to innate nature. You could also understand this from a Taoist perspective as shenxing, manifesting innate nature. But in Japanese, this is kensho. So this phrase becomes used to talk about some kind of enlightenment experience, right? And I think there is a way to link it to Taoism. So we have stages on the Daoist quietistic contemplative path. It gets mapped out this way. It's not quite this simple, and it also depends on how much experience we have with meditation, where we begin this meditation practice. But when we just think of like an ordinary life, maybe we begin meditation practice in a state of major agitation, which also relates to turbidity, minor agitation, moving into kind of equal agitation and stillness, into minor stillness. So this is what we've been talking about through this whole Lundao Jing. So that also relates to clarity, and then major stillness or major clarity. So actually, these are more like moments in practice. It could be sequential, right? It can unfold this way. So we can have this thing where, like, as our practice deepens, we don't really have minor agitation anymore. We have minor stillness. Maybe sometimes we have major stillness. Maybe sometimes some agitation shows up in stillness, but it's primarily still minor stillness, and so on. So it's not necessarily sequential, and it's not necessarily constant. Okay? And this is one thing to keep in mind, because depending on what happens in our lives, there might be things that come up that are cause major agitation reactions. So even if we have minor stillness or major stillness in our meditation practice, there's some kind of life event that causes upheaval and difficulty. And so then we engage it using the same principles. So ultimately, from this perspective, more of a quietistic perspective, a cosmological perspective, we're moving from turbidity and agitation into clarity and stillness. Okay, and so there's a kind of there's an alchemical view of yin and yang. Right, so turbidity and agitation being yin in the sense of negative here, so not cosmologically speaking, alchemically speaking, and clarity and stillness being yang in the sense of positive. Right? But it's more complicated than that, because when you think of stillness, stillness is actually yin. So that would be the positive yin counterpart of the negative yin counterpart of turbidity. And agitation is yang, because it's movement, literally means movement. So agitation being a kind of negative yang state that becomes the positive yang state of clarity. Okay. And then we get into a whole nother kind of Taoist symbol system that I won't talk about at the moment. So in our practice, in addition to the influence of the kind of classical Taoist text, there's a larger set of influences. Okay. And so one of the major influences is Niu Jinbao. His Taoist name is Xuan Jin, mysterious gold. He lived from 1915 to 1988. And he was a senior disciple of Zhao Bichen, who lived from 1860 to 1942, and a first-generation member of the Qianfeng, the Thousand Peaks lineage. So I mentioned this in the tradition, the Taoist tradition, Lundao. This is technically a sublineage of the wuwei sublineage of the Longmen Dragon Gate lineage of Quanzhen Complete Perfection Taoism, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, okay. But the point here is that some of the influence on the practice is modern, it's late, but also it's rooted in internal alchemy. So I'll explain why that's important in a moment. So in this key poem of Niu Jinbao, where he's talking about quiet sitting, he says, when beginning seated meditation, training in stillness practice, so this is the Qigong that I mentioned earlier, the whole body, both inside and outside, must become relaxed. With the 5 centers facing the heavens, sit cross-legged. Pressing zi and wu together, that mudra, eliminate any extraneous thoughts. With the two eyes hanging like curtains, guard the elixir cavity. With the tongue sealing the celestial pool, saliva is naturally produced. Deep, fine, long, and even, harmonize exhalation and inhalation. The heart-mind settled and thinking interrupted is perfect accomplishment. Body and mind are both forgotten with the myriad sounds silenced. When the mouth fills with the clear fluids, swallow them down. After meditation, wipe the face and smooth out the sinews and chi. Massage the whole body from top to bottom, one time. So in our practice, and in the way that this has been taught to us and transmitted to us, there are layers of the practice. So one layer of the practice is a commentary on Zhuangzi chapter 4, right? Don't listen with the ears, listen with the heart-mind. Don't listen with the heart-mind, listen with qi. So what does that mean? It means that we're basically bringing in the senses. So we're directing the sense perception into the body, right? So bringing in the listening into the center of the head, and then focusing on the tip of the nose, bringing the gaze down from the tip of the nose, down past the heart. So don't listen with the heart-mind, pass through the heart-mind, allow the heart to be empty, allow that to be this empty space where spirit can be present, and then sinking into the navel region, qi-hai, the ocean of qi, the primary storehouse of qi in the body, and listen with the qi. So let the qi store and sink into the navel region. Okay? So one of the reasons to point this out is that there are different influences on the practice. So here now we have a very technical kind of discussion of the posture. The 5 centers usually refer in meditation practice to the crown of the head, the center of the palms, and the soles of the feet. So in our case, we're practicing modified Burmese posture, but all of those are pointing upward, right? So the 5 centers facing the heavens, in this case, facing towards the head, and then beyond the head into the sky, and then pressing Zi and Wu together, and so on. And then I'm going to talk about this in a moment, self-massage. So we have this here. So one of the reasons to tell you this and is that what we're doing here has an internal alchemy component. So that's not part of classical Taoism. If you're talking about things like the meridians, using these technical terms like the celestial pool, the elixir cavity, Zi and Wu, the 5 centers, all of these kinds of things, you're into a later moment in the tradition. It's still relatively early when we think of Taoist history, and especially the history of Taoist meditation, but it's not anything like the classical Taoist materials. They don't use this language, and they don't have this fully developed kind of Taoist alchemical body. So this is why when I teach the practice, I speak about our approach being primarily quietistic with an alchemical dimension. The quietistic part is really the way that we approach the practice, the way that we understand the practice, the view that we use. But the secondary alchemical is that we are activating and engaging the alchemical body. So we're having a kind of energetic experience that may or may not overlap with classical Taoism. And I'll explain this more in a moment. So specifically, if you're referring to a dantian in the body, this may or may not be familiar to you, but if you know Taoism, you know, this is a kind of term that's used all of the time, the dantian, the elixir field. So when it's just used without any kind of qualification, it usually refers to the navel region, sometimes referred to as the lower abdominal region. So it's a subtle space inside the body in that area that's thought to be the storehouse of qi. Right, so also called qi-hai, the ocean of energy. And so if we just kind of defamiliarize this, dan means cinnabar and tian means field. So the field where you discover the cinnabar or where you transmute the cinnabar into the dan, into the elixir. So that's why it usually gets translated as elixir field, not cinnabar field. So there's a space inside the body where we refine the elixir, where we actually engage in some kind of alchemical transmutation. There technically are 3 elixir fields, which I'll talk about more in the Yangsheng talk. But here what I want to point out is that we're focusing on the navel region as the dantian, especially as the lower dantian, as the lower elixir field. That is relatively late in Taoism, right? So one of the most influential discussions of it is in the Huangtingjing, the scripture on the yellow court. that probably dates to around the 3rd century CE. So if we're using a kind of conservative date on the zhuangs of materials and say around 200 BCE, and then we'll just use a kind of easier date for the Huangting Jing and say like maybe 250 CE, you know, this is almost 500 years later that you get this. But, and this is an important qualification, even though this language isn't used in classical Taoism, you do find a reference to the belly, fu, in the Tao Te Ching. So Tao Te Ching chapter 3 says, empty the heart, mind, and fill the belly, which informs the way we do this practice. This character fu also appears in chapter 12. Okay, so there is a kind of proto sense in classical Taoism of some kind of focus on the belly, quote unquote. You know, now is that more about ingestion? Is that more about a digestive process, focusing on the belly in the sense of where we get our kind of core nourishment? Or is it more this energetic view? I think there are hints that it has this energetic view. But in any case, we're adding an alchemical layer to the practice. One really interesting part of Taoist meditation, especially if it's done in this holistic and integrated way, is it involves Daoyin practice, guided stretching, and also Anmo massage practice. So the massage usually gets referred to as self-massage. Daoyin literally means guiding and pulling. So I prefer to translate it more technically. It's usually part of Yangsheng practice, nourishing life practice. I prefer to translate it technically as guided stretching. And Anmo, so literally pressing and rubbing, so self-massage. So when we finish meditation, we do stretching, we do breath work, we do self-massage. And I think one way to understand this is self-massage is really a hallmark of Taoist meditation. It refocuses us on the psychosomatic and energetic nature of the practice, because we don't just stop meditating and get up. We actually move through the body, open the body back up, release any kind of stagnation before we discontinue the practice. So the image here you might recognize if you know something about the history of Taoist Daoyin practice. It's part of the seated 8 brocades. There's a whole bunch of practices related to this, but beating the celestial drum, which I'll talk about more at a different time. But in any case, there is a connection with the kind of self-massage that we do and the seated 8 brocades. And there is a Yangsheng Lundao that's coming up, and then also an online practice session video. So just a few more things that I want to talk to you about. Time and place. So when we do the practice, we usually do it in the early morning, right after we wake up, or in the late evening, right before we go to sleep. So this depends upon your time schedule, your other commitments, how tired you are, and so on. But usually twice a day, thinking about it at the beginning of like 20 to 30 minutes. So any amount of stillness is fine, will help you. But there is a kind of sense of like, try to start with like 15 or 20 minutes, then move into 30 minutes. And what you'll find is once you start meditating for 30 minutes, it naturally changes. Okay, so you'll start to sit for longer periods of time. Okay, so morning and evening, but in a kind of fully developed Taoist practice regimen, you know, more the way that we do it, we tend to do empty standing, quiet standing, which is another practice session, in the morning, and do empty sitting or quiet sitting in the evening right before going to sleep. As I said, twice a day. You can obviously do it more. You might just find time during the day to sit in stillness and just settle down. Place is important. So again, if we think about the psychosomatic nature of Taoist practice, that includes things like feng shui consideration, the actual space that we're in, the relationship of the space to our practice, to our bodies. So ideally, you want a kind of empty, quiet space. A lot of people don't have this luxury or this privilege. So what ideally you want to do is set aside a specific place inside of a room where you do the practice, and then sit in that same place. And so you're kind of building an energetic signature to that place. But ideally, you want the place to be quiet. You want the place to be empty, right, with very few things around. So if there are things like art or books, make sure that they support practice and so on. And then the other thing I would say is that this is also beyond, right, space and time. So we don't want to get too obsessed with the timing of it. or the place-specific aspect, we can always cultivate stillness. This practice is also a safeguard against various spiritual traps and trappings, which are all over the modern world. I mean, most of what goes by the name of spiritual cultivation, including even Daoist practice, has some aspect of these. So spiritual athleticism, trying to become more or great or whatever, and all of these kinds of things. Spiritual bypassing, that is avoiding some fundamental issue in our lives by using spiritual practice and kind of not facing some fundamental issues. So for example, deficiencies or negative qualities that we need to transform, or things that we've been through, right, that we need to rectify or purify or atone for. Spiritual dilettantism, so just trying everything and combining things in all of these ways where you don't really know what you're doing or you're not necessarily going to make progress. So having a committed practice is really important. Spiritual exhibitionism, so that relates also to spiritual athleticism. Spiritual athleticism is more of like doing excess. Spiritual exhibitionism is drawing unnecessary attention to oneself or making practice about that. Right? Spiritual materialism, a famous book by Chogyam Trungpa, using spiritual practice as a means to acquire things, right? To think about yourself in egoic ways, to make yourself more, all of these kinds of things. And other parlor tricks, and by parlor tricks, I mean demonstrations of powers and things like that. So the key thing here is don't get distracted, don't be confused, right? Understand the practice. In this case, quietistic meditation, so quiet sitting, is a safeguard against this because we know that there's really nothing to attain. We don't have to chase after things. We don't have to develop ourselves. We definitely don't have to exhibit anything. We're returning to the ground of our being. Okay. So again, this relates to the view, and I assume since you've listened this long, you have some resonance with this. So the practice is both necessary and sufficient. It's enough. We don't need more. So this is a kind of return model. And then finally, just to kind of let you think about some of the kinds of experiences. So we have different kinds of experiences through this practice, right? And from a Daoist perspective, especially a kind of classical and foundational perspective, these are natural outcomes and byproducts. We need to avoid potential attachment and distraction to them. Right? So for instance, like when we read the texts in Zhuangzi chapter 6, we find this reference to woman Yu, or sometimes it's translated as Dame Quickback. And she talks about externalizing things, right? So there are these three externalizations that she talks about. It's actually part of a larger system and set of experiences that she's describing. But she talks about externalizing things. And in Zhuangzi 17, it says, do not let what is on the outside wipe out what is on the inside. So we're going deeper into these stillness states. So emptiness, forgetfulness, absorption, and so on. And this relates to thinking about the kind of square inch as the subtle space inside of ourselves where we disappear into the Tao and find that connection, and Taoism as this numinous thread. So again, Zhuangzi chapter 4 says, look into that watchtower, the empty room, Shu Shi, where brightness is born. And we go into this space. We find these deeper layers of our experience and of our connection. So thank you for listening to this Daoist Lundao. In the Daoist tradition, we oftentimes say Dao Qi Changsun, may the Qi of the Tao be forever preserved, and Cibei. So Cibei means compassion, but Daoists oftentimes use Cibei for thank you. So Cibei, stay safe and well.